I know there are some people that have heard me say this a lot already, but welcome, thanks for joining us. If you could just have a quick look at the poll that's up on the screen and answer it to let us know how much experience you have of action learning, so we know how much background information about practice to be sharing as part of the webinar today. Okay. I don't want to hold anyone up any longer, so I'm going to ask Becky to... Oh, I've had a couple more. Okay, last time I'm going to say this. Anyone that's just arrived in the room, if you could have an answer of that poll that's up on the screen to let us know your experience of action learning. And then we are going to be closing that poll in a minute. Welcome to everyone that's joined us. No problem for anyone that's joining us late. It's absolutely fine. The internet shenanigans are strong. Okay, right, Becky, I'm going to ask you to close that poll for us now, and we can crack on. If anyone else does arrive, that's absolutely fine. So if you could share the results with us, that would be great. Okay, so there is a real mix of people that have come to join the webinar today, and a quarter of you are completely new to action learning. That is great. You are very welcome here, because the things that we're going to be talking about, I will talk about action learning, but it's also going to be much more broadly applicable to other spaces as well. So hopefully this is going to be of interest to everyone. Okay, stop sharing that poll. Great. If you could remove that, that's lovely. Okay, so the last thing that I'm going to ask of you for now is just double checking that most people are okay with the audio. If you can hear me okay, if you could do a thumbs up in the chat or a yes, that would be great. We can just, brilliant. Okay, so we've got a sense that audio is working okay for most people. That is great. And the other tech thing to say today, I'm sure most of you are super familiar with using Zoom. If you haven't done a webinar before, there is a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, which is the one thing that's a bit different. And that's what we're going to be using for sharing any questions that you've got today. So we'll have a Q&A section at the end. And if you do have any questions that you want to ask, if they come up during the presentation, you can add them in the Q&A then, or you can wait until we get to that portion after the presentation. But that Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, that's your place to add those questions. Okay. So yes, the thing to know is that we will be sending a recording of the webinar, and if you would like a PDF of the slides that I'm going to be sharing, you can email us back when we send you out the link to the recording, and we will send you a copy of the slides so you've got all of those notes. Okay. So I'm just going to share this screen with you, and we'll get cracking. Okay. Action learning and neurodiversity. How can we create more inclusive spaces? So in terms of who you're going to be hearing from today, I'm Mel Scaffold. I joined ALA in May, and I'm an action learning facilitator. I'm a coach, organizational development consultant, and my background is in the arts. So I've worked in 20 years in arts and cultural management. And also with us today, we've got Sonia Antel, who's a long-standing director of ALA. Sonia, if you could just give a wave.
Yeah. Hi, folks. I saw some people I know in the chat, so welcome to those I know and welcome to those I don't. So I'm long-standing director of ALA, and I'll be in the background and hoping to manage the chat, and I'll help have a conversation with Mel and everybody when we get through it. So I'll take my I'll go mute and take my video off to prevent distraction.
Great, thanks, Sonia. And we've also got Becky Danks-Burrows here on IT. She's also the person that's going to be sending you an email with the recording, and you can get in touch with her if you've got any questions for us after that. So how it's going to run today, we will have a presentation that's about 20 minutes, and I'll do an introduction. I'll do a really brief Action Learning 101, particularly for the people here who are new to Action Learning. And then we'll talk about characteristics in terms of neurodiversity, neurodivergence, and the impact that this can have in our facilitated spaces. And then we'll be specifically looking a little bit at what that means for action learning. And then we'll be talking about practical actions, things that we can do to create more inclusive spaces. And after that, there'll be a good chunk of time for Q&A where you can share your experiences, reflections, tips, and questions for us and for each other. So before we start, I want to be really clear about a disclaimer. I am not speaking on behalf of anyone. I'm not speaking on behalf of neurodivergent folks or as an expert. I'm talking about my personal learning journey, about making facilitation and particularly action learning spaces more inclusive for people who are neurodivergent. And that's generously informed by many neurodivergent people that I've been working with over the last few years. And in terms of what is neurodiversity, so neurodiversity is not the same thing as being neurodivergent. And some of the things that I'm going to be talking about today, some of you will know intimately and really well, and some of these might be new ideas to some of you. So I just want to be clear about that at the start, because neurodiversity is it's a positive term for describing the differences in people's thought processes and behaviors. And I consider myself to be broadly neurotypical. That is, for the most part, I think and learn in ways considered to be the norm. And I work with many people and have lots of family members who are neurodivergent, which is a broad category of neurological difference that includes autism spectrum condition, ADHD, so you probably know about that, and it also includes dyslexia and dyspraxia. And current estimates are that about 15 to 20% of the population are neurodivergent in some ways and often in multiple ways. And another note on how I'll be using language today. So neurodivergent people and particularly autism advocates use what's called identity first language, which is that they often prefer to say autistic rather than a person with autism. So I'm following their lead on that. But again, every person is different and has a different take on this. And then lastly, it's important to recognize that multiplicity is key. And there are huge differences, obviously, in terms of neurodivergent people's experiences. And you'll probably have heard this, but it's worth bearing in mind. Dr. Stephen Shaw, who is an autism advocate, said famously, if you've met one autistic person, you've met one autistic person. And that really it kind of informs our thinking in terms of what we're talking about today. Having said that, there are some commonalities in terms of the challenges that neurodivergent folks face and the barriers that they experience, particularly in participating in things that are primarily set up without their needs in mind. And in terms of my perspective on inclusion and neurodiversity, over 20 years working as an arts manager and facilitator and coach, I've often been really challenged in my perception of what a genuinely inclusive environment means and what that looks like. And I think it's really important to be honest about those moments when we're challenged, because that's when we really learn and get better at what we do. And so in terms of action learning specifically, the questions that started coming up for me were things like, is it rude to move around when someone else is talking? Does active listening have to involve eye contact? And when can an open question feel overwhelming? And for me, this was about questioning the shoulds. So every adjustment that I've made to accommodate someone's needs has revealed a subconscious belief about how things should be done. And sometimes that means acknowledging my own privilege as someone who doesn't experience certain barriers in society. But every time I've put those changes into action, I felt a kind of opening up, both in terms of my thinking and in terms of the shared space that we inhabit. So a really brief overview for everyone to make sure we're on the same page, because I might be using some language that is specific to action learning. So what is action learning? It's that there's some slightly different approaches to action learning in different places, particularly globally, but the similarities at its core, the elements are, there is a structured process for reflecting on experience with a group of peers, and the name that we use for that group is a set, and it's based on the core techniques of coaching and feedback, where a person will share a challenge, the group will pose questions, and the person will reflect on those questions and choose actions to take forwards within that facilitated space. And that applies whether it's face-to-face action learning or online virtual space. So those are the core kind of principles that are going to be happening in almost every version of action learning. So you can see it's really similar to things like coaching and group or team coaching. There are some similarities there. So thinking about the main differences in terms of how neurodivergent and neurotypical people might experience the world and what impact that's going to have, the first thing we're thinking about is communication and communication processing. And this is a key area of difference for many neurodivergent people. And it affects how much information people need or can take in. Like, for example, is there too much information that might be conflicting, like these terrible signs on this slide? And that can be really overwhelming. The signs giving you different information. Conversely, is there not enough? Is there room for confusion in terms of the information that's being received? It also relates to preferred communication style. So some people may prefer visual or verbal communication over text, and also language construction. So some people find abstract language, metaphor, or idioms hard to understand. And then so the social piece, this is linked to communication and relates to interpreting social cues. So part of this applies to everyone, right? So the vast majority of what we communicate is unspoken. And without realizing it, we expect other people to be mind readers. So often what I mean and what you think I mean are completely different things. And add on top of that, there are loads of unwritten rules to neurotypical social engagement. And so there's a huge opportunity for things to get lost in translation. Sensory processing. So it's extremely common for neurodivergent people to get overwhelmed by sensory input. That might be sound or light or texture, the built environment, whether that's online or in person. And linked to that, something called proprioceptive input. So that's the kind of sense of your body in relation to the world around you. And while some people, some neurodivergent people get overwhelmed by too much sensory input, some people need more of it. So you might have seen like fidget toys for people with ADHD. That input helps regulate their responses to sensory overstimulation and distraction. So neurodivergent people often struggle when there's multiple distractions and find it really difficult to focus. And action learning, so that's intentionally a space without distractions. That's usually what we're aiming for. So if we get that right, it can be a really powerful haven. Routine, so dealing with something new or out of the ordinary, that's often a bigger challenge for neurodivergent folks. And then what I think of as a kind of secondary challenge or barrier is this thing around self-regulation. And what I mean by that is dealing with what happens when people experience challenges as a result of a world that's not designed for them. So neurodivergent people are more likely to become overwhelmed and need time and space to self-regulate. However, finding or claiming that space is often not welcomed or encouraged or understood. So that can create additional barriers. And how might this show up in action learning and in similar spaces? So discomfort with the new. Action learning, to me, doesn't say what it is on the tin. That can be quite opaque. It's a specific methodology. And even though once you know it, it can feel really simple. That's very intimidating to step into that new space to begin with. And that links to this idea of information, the communication that we share before and during a new process or experience, and the instructions we give in the session as well. So it's really about being aware of the scope for different interpretations, particularly when you think about the jargon that we use. So set, process, space, facilitator, presentation, feedback. These are all words that have specific meanings in a specific context. That's a lot to take in terms of a new process, and there's a lot of space for interpreting those things differently. Space in terms of action learning is really important. So looking at this picture of this fishbowl meeting room, who does that work for? Who does it not work for? And that's physical space, but also online virtual space. So thinking about sensory input, distractions that you might not otherwise notice. And then we've got what I think of as the big two. And I'm going to share this in the words of Morgan Kalser, who's a neurodivergent writer and activist, who I think puts this brilliantly. There are two key strains on the system of someone with ADHD and, in many cases, autism in those kinds of workshop settings. One is the sensory stimulation and executive function elements of prolonged listening, taking in everyone's words and body language and dealing with all the often high velocity thoughts evoked in our own minds takes a lot more from us than it does from neurotypical brains. Quite simply, we reach capacity, feeling full up much sooner than others. So that's prolonged listening. And then stillness. And again, from Morgan Kalser, if our bodies are still for too long in the same position, it can be more difficult for us to feel our bodies and stay connected. This gets very uncomfortable and almost unbearable at times. So you can see how the very structure of action learning and other kind of similar facilitated spaces might throw up these additional challenges. Luckily, there are some really simple, practical actions that we can take that are going to create a much more inclusive environment from the start. And that begins with anticipate. Anticipate. So as the facilitator, we should be anticipating needs rather than waiting for someone to ask, I think. And the reason for that is that participants often won't or can't advocate for themselves. And there's lots of reasons for that. It includes the habit of questioning the validity of their own need, masking to make other people feel more comfortable, and a fear of disrupting the flow of the session. So anticipating those needs, and also anticipating and making space for people to articulate their exclusion. So getting comfortable with people saying they feel excluded and responding to that challenge in an open and generous way. Be person-centered. Everyone has their own unique combination of needs and preferences, everyone. So ask what they are. There's no one size fits all. Bring that genuine spirit of inquiry, which is the reason that most people become facilitators, coaches. It is that spirit of inquiry. Bring it to your whole practice. Communicate with compassion. And by that, I mean, so communication is the foundation of all good facilitation. But we've all had experience where we can tell the facilitators on autopilot. I've been that facilitator. And so communicating with compassion is in a way that's finely tuned and responsive to the needs in that specific group. from the invitation stage onwards. Pay attention, including to when people might be shutting down. And that looks like the amount and format of information. So making the advance information clear and concise to help manage people's expectations without overloading them. And for people who need an extra level of detail, having that comprehensive version ready in advance with pictures of the space or the participants or the activity. And so, for example, I led a session last month and an autistic participant asked for images of a particular activity that we were going to be doing so that they would feel more comfortable knowing what they were going to be taking part in. And so I've now wrapped that into my pre-session information. And again, that's something that I now know to be offering as standard rather than having to wait to be asked. You also might be including more visual symbols, images, thinking about the format of the information and how and when you share it. No reading between the lines. So clear, well-paced communication that doesn't require anyone to read between the lines. Invite questions. Action learning is all about inviting questions, but invite questions of yourself as the facilitator, about your method and about the process, about what people are going to be expected to do at each stage of it. And that fosters that equal peer support environment that we're aiming for. Think about what questions work. So open questioning is one of the 2 key skills at the core of action learning. And some participants may prefer short, concrete questions. So listen closely and follow their lead. This is something that I've really had to learn because in terms of my style as a coach and as a facilitator, I often work a lot with metaphor that's grounded in images or phrases that have been offered up by the client. And I have one ADHD client where that works extremely well, helps them to think differently. And I also have recently an autistic set member where this approach was really alienating to them. And I had to check myself to tune into them more closely. And, these are things that are applicable to good facilitation generally, but even more important in this case. And remember that listening can look different. So the other key skill in terms of action learning is listening. And when I trained as a coach and facilitator, we were taught what this should look like. And we were told it included a lot of eye contact, for example. So for a lot of neurodivergent people, that can be extremely uncomfortable. And making the group aware that listening can look different. So, for example, I had a recent online course where I didn't check in about what would be comfortable at the start. And about halfway through, one autistic set member requested to work with cameras off because I hadn't offered that as an option at the start. And the rest of the group wanted to keep theirs on. So I facilitated a conversation around that. And it made a big difference to how that person could participate, but they shouldn't have had to ask. So I know that can feel intimidating, and it's our responsibility to make sure that shared space works for everyone. And a couple of final things: create this comfortable space. So the sensory environment can really make or break someone's experience of a session. An easily navigable space with no distracting sounds or visual stimulation is a really good starting point. That tiny electrical hum that a lot of you can probably hear somewhere in your room at the moment if you close your eyes, that could be excruciating for somebody over a few hours. And working online, so Zoom brings with it a different set of challenges and techniques to mitigate them. So you can't control other people's spaces in the same way, but you can provide guidance to minimize those distractions. Things like comfort might mean screen off. Having the freedom to move. This can be quite radical to a lot of action learning and other workshop spaces. And comfort is really related to how free we feel to move and behave in a way that feels natural to us. It's really easy to get set in a routine in terms of timing, for example. We might expect a group to sit for an hour or more, but for some people this just isn't possible and prevents them from focusing. And that also relates to moving while sitting. We usually ask people not to take notes in action learning situations. Had a recent neurodivergent set member who could only think, concentrate when they were drawing, when they were doodling. And giving that option ahead of time can make a really big difference to how able they feel to engage in the process. Creating more pauses and snack breaks, adding in more time checks, paying attention to when people are flagging. Like, these are all practices that support people with specific needs, but also end up paying off for the whole group. And valuing difference. So one of the things that I absolutely love about action learning is the opportunity to learn from people with different backgrounds, different perspectives and experiences, and that includes neurodiversity. So people's differences are not a problem to be solved. They're an opportunity to discover more about them, about us, about ourselves, about the society we live in. And creating an environment that welcomes neurodivergent people will create more diverse groups, obviously, richer exchanges, greater shared wisdom. And it also makes the invitation to action learning more welcoming for everyone. And for me and for everyone, I think this is really a process of continued learning and exchange. And the most important thing is learning from neurodivergent people. So as a coach and facilitator, I'm always trying to put myself in the position of student, being open to feedback. And the tips today are some of my personal learning, generously informed by the neurodivergent participants and colleagues who've pointed out where and how I could do better. And as with all work around accessibility and inclusion, the most important voices are those of people experiencing exclusion. And there are some great resources you can access. I'd recommend Understanding Autism Level 2, TQ UK qualification that is very informed by neurodivergent voices. That's a free qualification you can do via the Skills Network if you're interested, or just Google it. There's loads of windows into that. And neurodivergent advocacy on social media is a brilliant activism space. There's a few of my favorite follows here that I've learned from. And the other thing that I would say, just to draw that to a close, is don't be afraid to make mistakes. Whether it's our language or our actions, trying something is always better than not trying it at all. Even if it doesn't land right the first time, try, make mistakes, and get better. And that's very much in the spirit of action learning. So that's the end of my part today. Now we want to hear from you. If you have any questions that have come up as a result of this presentation, any tips that you want to share, your own experiences, please drop those. Could you add those to the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we will work through as many of those as we can. And I'm going to start by having a quick question with Sonia once I have stopped sharing my screen. There we go.
So we've got a couple of great questions there, Mel, but I just wanted to make an observation from my practice as an action learning facilitator, and I'd be really interested to see what you think of this. Now, obviously, we've always had neurodivergent people with us, and we've worked virtually for a long time, but I especially noticed, well, say during COVID, since 2020, when when 95% of stuff is online, I've noticed it's sort of come up much more in groups. And the kinds of things I've noticed, I've had people in sets who say to me clearly, I can't sit still for 3 hours, even if you give me breaks. And they're on, like a big gym ball, and their head is going like that, make you feel a bit seasick. And they've talked about that. I've had, I don't know, a handful of people over the time saying, I think you mentioned this, I can't look directly at a screen, it's too intense. I need to have my screen off. So there's lots of different kinds of things. And how is it I'm noticing it more? I noticed it more when everything went online. What's that about? Because it must have been in the room before, in the physical room. So what's that about?
Well, again, I would love for other people to put their responses to this in the Q&A. I think there are a few things that I would reflect on. The first is that I have, in my experience, been able to welcome a lot more people who self-identify as neurodivergent into online spaces because they've said they feel more comfortable there. There's a degree of control in terms of an online space that is slightly different to a face-to-face experience. So people feel more, and again, this is a massive generalization, but I have had people say that they feel more comfortable in online spaces. I think there's a couple of other things though. One is that certainly over the last few years, the conversation around neurodiversity and neurodivergent activism, for example, has become a lot more present. So I think people are getting more comfortable advocating for themselves and for their needs. And that's been facilitated kind of throughout lockdown and through a lot of our worlds going online. There was a more general conversation around how does everyone live online? How do we deal with this? What are the difficulties that we're experiencing? So it doesn't feel so alienating to be part of that conversation. And so I think those are a few of those reasons. But as you say, like, this is something that has always been a challenge. You know, these spaces are designed in a particular way. People have always been excluded from them, even, you know, with the best intentions of the facilitator. And so I think it's that kind of reflective circle of we're becoming more aware of it, so we're more open to hearing it, and that also makes people feel more comfortable sharing it. Just going to see what's...
So the first question, and I've got a thought about it, but I'd be interested to hear from you. Someone here, Andy, is saying the majority of their staff are autistic, and starting with action learning is awkward because it's new and unnatural and open. So how do they get started, or what can we, and have you got any thoughts about what to do there?
Okay, so I'll have a go at that one first, and then if you want to chip in, Sonia.
Yes, certainly.
So this is really interesting because I went to an action learning facilitators gathering last week, and we were talking about inclusion more generally. But I think one of the key things, the most important things, was thinking around what is translatable from action learning into experiences that people have already had or language that they are already familiar with. Trying to not be so precious around things like the language, or it might even be about flexibility in terms of the process. It's about going, what of these tools that we have in this brilliant action learning toolkit are useful and applicable here, rather than trying to fit people into a rigid structure, going, what about these tools and this structure is useful for these people? And with that, and that is, again, it might be about making that bespoke for every group that you work with. And that's quite a different way about thinking about action learning. So that's kind of one of the key areas that I'm thinking about at the moment. What about you, Sonia?
Yeah, like a starter, that kind of practice. I had somebody, this was a couple of years ago now in a set, who said to me very directly and clearly that she's neurodivergent and found the open nature of it very difficult. And one of the things that we talked about, and then I did it, she said, if I knew when stages started and ended, I would feel, I can't remember if the word was safer, but it felt like safer, more boundaried. I'd know where I was going, I'd be on a journey. So for each of the stages, I put so many minutes, and we issued a kind of a handout, if you like. So we had like an agenda, and that really helped her. And there was no loss of learning, you know, or safety for others. So that was actually really quite interesting. So that's one thought there, Andy, for that question. Let's see. Yeah, we've got somebody, Julie, talking about the whole concept of open questions is quite challenging. I don't know. I mean, certainly the person I was talking about found the general openness and emergence of it sort of threatening, and that was the best. That's what I did, was kind of structured it more tightly. I don't know if you've got a thought about that there, Mel?
In terms of sorry, the questions moving
It's,
around as I'm looking at them. So in
yeah,
terms of this, I mean, there are some really simple things that can help people with that, which include, so most people who have been introduced to action learning will be familiar with some kind of basic questions that always work. And it's entirely possible to do a whole action learning session just using those questions, similar to coaching and similar to a lot of other facilitated spaces. It's amazing how much you can do just using 2 or 3 questions and actually making that an intentional practice. So just saying, here's 10 questions. We're going to try and just use these 10 questions today. So people aren't under pressure to try and think of new and specific questions. And there was a brilliant example of this in a blog on our website a while ago, where the evidence of this is basically in the fact that even if you can't hear the presentation somebody's giving and the responses that they're giving to your questions, the questions that you give will still be useful if they're good questions. So that just goes to show that you can use there are some brilliant open questions that you can use that the presenter is going to find helpful, regardless of them not being specifically tailored, if that makes sense, which I feel relieves a lot of that pressure.
Yeah. And Bonnie, who we know, has got a brilliant kind of question here that came from a participant. And it sounds as though Bonnie hasn't said, but it does sound as though it's somebody who's neurodivergent. And they said if they were a presenter, could they answer a question not with words but through gestures or dance? Now I've heard 1 or 2 experimental situations where that's been done, but I don't know otherwise. And it's because she found the volume of words just too much.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've got any experience or reflection there, Mel.
Yes, and I think it's again, it's about kind of taking these tools of action learning and using them in different ways, which the whole point of it is to be useful to the presenter. And so forcing that presenter into communicating in a way that isn't comfortable for them, that's not useful. So so for example, when you do forms of action learning, kind of different versions of action learning, like laser action learning, where you might give somebody a lot of questions and they take them away with them, or they respond to just one, or they write down their answers to them, or they can draw an answer. These are all absolutely, I mean, the thing is, I would also say, to caveat this, it's not up to any of us to validate what action learning is. I don't think it's about, okay, using these basic principles, what's going to work for these specific people. So absolutely dance an answer, write an answer, draw an answer, and do that in a way that feels comfortable and useful. I would say the flip side of this that I just want to pick up on from the earlier question around moving through discomfort is, again, it's about treading that very careful line in terms of not managing discomfort totally out of a process, because coaching, action learning is uncomfortable at times, because you are interrogating your thoughts and beliefs about things a lot of the time. And we don't want to be patronizing by saying, oh, we don't want people to ever be uncomfortable. It's about recognizing what the comfort and discomfort relate to. Is it the structure, is the assumptions we're making, or is it the experience they're having in terms of maybe revisiting something or interrogating something? So that's, yeah, I think that question around comfort is really interesting.
Yeah, that's a really good observation, actually. Now, Nasna, I think it is here, is saying, how do you manage to facilitate when you've got these different needs, but you've only got a certain amount of time for a presentation? Now, that really is a tough one. I don't know if you can help there at all, Mel. What's your best,
I mean, yeah, it's really hard. And I think partly the time management thing is always an issue in action learning, because some presentations you feel could go on for 4 hours. So it's part of it's the kind of general time management challenge in terms of facilitation. That's part of the job. this is something, again, that I was just thinking about. It came up last week because time is one of the most pressing issues that we're facing at the moment. And I expect this is the case for a lot of people that are here with us today, that we're finding if you are a facilitator in action learning or anything else, you're being asked to do more in a shorter amount of time. And so trying not to compromise the quality of that experience, being realistic about what you can achieve, and at the same time being able to argue for the amount of time that you need to do anything at all, I think is a really live, it's a really live issue. And it might be that you go, okay, well, today we are just going to do this one thing, or we have a shorter version of this process, again, using those different versions where people offer a range of questions and somebody just takes one of those forwards. This is where those time pressures, it can be about finding kind of creative techniques and responses that center the communication form that people are comfortable with, and then try and work out, okay, well, how long does it take to have a quality experience using that form, and then design the structure out from there.
Yeah. And actually on this point, Emma makes a really good point. I don't know if you can see it, but I'll read it out. She's talking about general workshop facilitation rather than action learning particularly. And she's had feedback that these things have helped autistic participants. And what she's saying is I give people time to think about and note down their thoughts on a question individually.
Yeah.
And then discuss in twos or threes, and then go to the whole group. And what she's saying, that with the classic kind of mix of talking and post-its and so on, people get to think and share in their own way, and it's less. Hearing it, it just sounds safer to me for somebody whose neurodivergent needs are not met in that space. So I thought that's quite interesting.
Yeah, I absolutely love that kind of, it's a person-centered approach, and it's a creative response. It incorporates those different methodologies into the process, rather than going, well, because of this person, we're going to do it this way. It's about having multiple approaches in a space, and some of those are going to resonate better with different people. So yeah, I think I really welcome that approach. I'm going to be we'll be able to copy down the questions that people have shared today and any tips, and we will be using them. Thank you.
Delia here makes a good point, and I think it's within this conversation. She's got a group of people with a range of neurodivergent people, and she's talking about prolonged listening being difficult, like you said, and the needs to clarify every stage of the set. And she's asking about ideas, and the best I can come up with is that piece about timing and structure and kind of making it tighter and shorter. That's my thought there. Don't know if you've got any other thought about that, Mel.
Yeah, I think having things like a visual crib note sheet is really helpful. So an icon for each of those stages.
Nice, yeah.
And being able to refer to that icon, have a card, you can like have icon cards up and have that icon on a little flip chart or a board, so that people always know where they are and can see what's coming next. That's one of the ways that we can think about that. And also a lot of that is about practice. So for anyone that's doing action learning or any sort of regular group process where there's kind of repetition time to time, it's absolutely, I think it's absolutely fine to spend that extra time at the start, rather than try and rush through so you can get to the actual meat of the inside of the process, because that's going to embed it's that I've forgotten the word for the thing that I'm thinking of, but it's that kind of bodily memory of the process. Again, it might be cards, it might be a physical movement that goes with each of those stages, things that are going to help people to sense them in their body or in their preferred communication style, rather than trying to remember it in words or just keep it in their heads.
Yeah, I love the idea for each stage. There's a really interesting observation and question here from Melanie, and it speaks to broader facilitation than just action learning. And she starts with, not everyone's got a diagnosis, nor are they looking for one, and that's quite right. And she's asking about the other things that might be going on for people. As an example, someone's feeling anxious in the room about the windows or doors, and how do you go into a group managing that? And my initial thinking on my feet response is for some of that stuff, it's about being awareness of what's in the room and the space. If you know there's organizational pressures, or you can see there's certain issues in the room, making it spoken, asking people what they need to make themselves comfortable. It's those kinds of things. So it may or may not be people who describe themselves as neurodivergent, or as she says, don't have a label and don't want one or aren't looking for it. But I don't know what your thought is about, almost every other stuff that's in the room, which may or may not be, stress or feelings around managing the space because you're neurodivergent.
Yeah, totally. And I think this comes back to that thing about anything that we do in terms of inclusion is going to make it a better process for everyone. And so I would say there's two kind of stages. One is the before you get in the room. And if you have the luxury of this, having, for example, if you have the opportunity to have one-to-one conversations with people that are going to be in a new process before they are in it, that is great, because you can answer any questions around process, around what's going to make them feel comfortable. If there's anything else that they'd like you to take on board, it can just be a 5 or 10 minute conversation. But one of the sets that I did last year, we were able to set up just a 5 to 10 minute Zoom call with each of the 6 participants in the couple of weeks leading up to it, and that made a huge difference. And so those things that people might not want to say in a room because they're worried about how it sounds, or because they don't want to take up space, that gives you the opportunity to do that. And then the other thing is just being really honest. And I think there can feel like a lot of responsibility as a facilitator to know it all, and to have this kind of omniscient kind of thing going on where you're expected to know all these things in advance. But just being really honest and saying, I've done the things that I've been able to think of. Please let us know what's working for you, and check in with people. Don't think just because they didn't say it that one time, then they might not want to say it another time. Halfway through the day, okay, we've been able to do this. What's working for you? What isn't? Is there anything that we need to change to make you feel more comfortable? And not worrying if you've got it wrong.
And that answer sort of speaks to the next question from Suri, I think it is, I was going to offer you. And what she's saying, I think, a question for everyone around inclusive, and you've unintentionally excluded someone. What do you, how do you manage that? My first thought is exactly the way that you described in the webinar. But and if you've got anything else to add there, it's a kind of ongoing, accepting that it's an ongoing learning process for us, owning that. No.
Yes, and I think this goes back to part of a question that we might not have addressed earlier about, does action learning just not suit some people? And if you create a group that works in a particular way for some of the participants, does that mean that it doesn't work? Like, is there a process that is going to work for everyone? Probably not, honestly, because there might be 2 people with whose needs are so conflicting that but that might just mean that they're not right to be in the same set or workshop together, and
same space.
It's okay. It's also okay that if action learning isn't for everyone. I believe that the tools of action learning can be useful for everyone. Does that mean the classic action learning framework is suitable for everyone? Maybe not. But I think the more creative and thoughtful we can be about how those tools can be used in different ways in different spaces, the more we kind of guarantee the future and legacy of them. So so if you have unintentionally excluded somebody and you know about that, or they've informed you of it, hands up. That is, yes, I own it, that is going to happen. And then mediating in a way that feels okay for those people, which might be individually, or it might be with both of them together, to see if there is some common shared ground. And if not, going, okay, so what are the different paths that we might take?
That makes sense. I think you've also kind of alluded to the answer here for Adrian. He's making a point that people in learning sets Rarely do people acknowledge or speak up front about particular needs they've got. And I can see you nodding to that. And he's saying he might spot stuff and adapt as you go, but it's how do you design and ensure stuff's met up front? And I guess that's to yours, if you can speak to people beforehand,
Yeah.
that's one way. It depends if it's a large event, that's hard. If you've got an event with 25 people, that might be hard, whereas you've got a small event, it might be possible. But it's a good, it's an important issue to think about, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah. And again, you can only work with the information that you're given. So giving people the opportunity to give you that information in a way that feels generous and welcoming is, I think, all you can do at that stage. There are different ways to elicit that information. So as one of the things that I've been learning about is the information that you give people up front is going to change how they articulate their needs. So being able to share images of what it's going to look like, videos of what it's going to look like. Firstly, they're going to enable people to have a much clearer sense of how that's going to feel for them. So having a video, whether you're doing whether it's a dance workshop or an action learning set, or an away day, it's the same principle. If you have photographs or videos of the type of things that you're going to be doing, people are going to be able to have a much clearer sense of what their needs are in that situation. And also, it demonstrates that you're really taking it seriously, because in the same way that happens with recruitment, say you see a statement that says, "We welcome applications from," and then the application process itself is horrendous.
Doesn't
I mean,
welcome them.
as you'll know, if you are neurodivergent, the process for getting a diagnosis as an adult is incredibly difficult to do if you are neurodivergent. It's almost designed that way. So up front, putting your intentions and credentials out there in a way that demonstrates that you are receptive and will do something with that feedback, I think is can really make a difference to how much people feel able to share their needs.
Yeah, I think so. And I think we've just got 3 or 4 minutes, and a question I did miss from Susan. Hi, Susan. I know we know each other of old. That she's interested in the whole conversation piece about screen on or screen off. And it's funny, it makes me reflect back to the early days of virtual action learning, where we did do audio action learning. And if we work with countries that have got poor Wi-Fi, like African countries, we just did audio from beginning to end. We never expected or tried do anything else. And that had meant for a kind of level comms. I think screen on or off is a different matter when you've got a mixed group, but I don't know if there's anything. I'm conscious we've got about 3 minutes, but anything you wanted to say there before I hand back to you, Mel? Well, in this last moment.
Yes. So in terms of that conversation, it worked absolutely fine. So that person had made it really clear that they didn't feel able to work with their camera on, so it wasn't an option for them. So basically the options were we would be able to include them in the group with their camera off, or we wouldn't be able to include them in the group. It felt so it was a very live issue to be dealing with once the set had already started. And but once we in kind of set the principles for, okay, well, how do we demonstrate to each other that we are listening and engaged? How do we show that we're listening if there's a mix of people involved? Obviously, if everyone with screens off is absolutely fine. If there's a mix of people, being able to trust that that person's engaged is by the fact that they're able to share questions and give feedback. And once you've done one round, that becomes really evident whether it's happening or not. And in this case, they were much more engaged because they weren't intimidated by the fact that they were on screen, and that was kind of overwhelming in terms of the amount of information that they were kind of trying to take in. And so again, for us, that was about trying it out. But now that I know and there are other ways for that person to be able to indicate that they're listening. They can use the kind of chat emoticons on Zoom. you know, just to kind of let the group know that they're there and listening and engaged, even if they're not offering a question. So so now I would say, having checked in with people's access needs at the start, I would offer that as an option, just to let people know that it can work. But yeah, again, it depends on your group and the different ways into it, but it definitely, for me, has proved that it works as a kind of mixed model.
Now we're beginning to lose people, so I'm going to hand back to you. We got most questions, and I'll take my camera off and let you close up. But thank you, everyone, for those questions. Just smash.
Yes, thank you so much. Sorry for any questions that we weren't able to get to. It has been amazing to hear about people's experiences and their questions, and hopefully if there's interest in these kind of getting into this more in depth, this is something that we will be able to share in the future. I'm just going to share our final screen. And okay, so Becky, if you could share our closing poll. So we are really interested in taking this further as a discussion and a learning process. If that is something that you would or wouldn't be interested in, either way, actually, we would love to hear from you. We are thinking about how we develop our offer and training in future to be ambitious and inclusive, and we'd love to know more about what you would be interested in. So if you could if you can see that poll and you can answer it, that would be amazingly helpful. We also have a renew new half-day CPD course coming up, which will put that information in the follow-up email to you with the presentation. We'll send the course and dates out with that. Let us know if that's something that you're interested in. And we will be updating our training accordingly. So as I said before, Becky's going to put the webinar recording up on YouTube. We'll send out a link to that within the next few days. And again, if you want the slides, if those will be useful to you, then let Becky know and she'll send them. Thank you so much for joining us here today. I really hope we can continue these conversations in the future. Thank you.